weekly look at all of the hot topics in HR.
Whether it's passive talent or it's active talent.
That's a soft skill that really gets undersold in the hiring process.
How to manage in the virtual environment.
You get a diverse cultured group of people, it's a win-win for everybody.
More conversion from candidate leads.
What does that look like in this new virtual world?
Welcome everyone to Talent Experience Live. Of course, your weekly look at hot topics in HRs, interviews with industry leaders, and hot new HR tech, covering everything that you need to know in talent acquisition, talent management, and of course, my favorite HR tech once again. Remember, we are live here every Thursday, noon Eastern time. So if you're joining us for the first time, or maybe the 27th time, as this is our 27th episode, feel free to hop into the chat. And if you weren't able to catch today's full episode or last week's episode, you can always find it on our Phenom blog, or log on to, thank you, Tom, for smashing the like button, or you can always log on to YouTube and catch the replay there. Before we get started, I see the chat's already begun to chime a little bit, but would love to hear where everyone is tuning in from. It looks like Angela is joining us from Philadelphia. Welcome, Matt from Los Angeles. So if you're here for a first time or for multiple times, feel free to share where you are joining us from. And always feel free to smash the like button like Tom mentioned, and follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, whatever your favorite social network is to get up-to-date content. We are doing these episodes on a weekly basis, but also pushing out content every single day for HR professionals just like you. Tom is joining us from Bucks County. Looks like we have a LinkedIn user from Flourtown. Morris is joining us from fabulous New Jersey. I'm a New Jersey native originally. I'm from New Jersey. So welcome all of you. This is super exciting. And I love that everyone is making their voice heard. I am Devin Foster, and today's topic is all around walking the walk, driving systemic change with a DE&I expert. However, before we get started, I've made a New Year's resolution to try and get as much engagement with the audience as I possibly can. And my new question this week is, what are you currently binge watching? I finished Emily in Paris, all 10 episodes in 2 nights. So needless to say, I recommend it. If you have any suggestions, feel free to drop them in there. Thank you, Len Roy, from joining us in Ohio, DC. I hope everyone is safe. And as you mention what you're binging right now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the topic today. As I mentioned, it is all around DE&I and walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And it's easy to see why this is driving organizations all over the place, because it is a hot button issue, especially after the protests over the summer and into the fall, and how instituting some of this organizational change requires significant time and effort. It is not just a switch that you can flip. So on this episode of TXL, we are diving into how to better understand DE&I as a continuum that can mature over time and be enhanced by HR technology that supports ERGs, internal mobility, data-driven decision-making, and showcasing a more inclusive work environment. It looks like Morris said he's watching Escape the Chateau. I cannot wait to watch that. Elaine says she is binging Million-and-One Things. So these are things for you to do, of course, after you watch TXL and binge all of 26 previous episodes of that. But back to the topic at hand, we have brought in a DE&I expert, and her name is Kristina Kohl, MBA and PMP Managing Principal at HRComputes, and is too familiar with organizations taking that check the box approach to such a complex issue as DE&I. So without any further hesitation, let's bring Kristina on and start the conversation. Hey, Kristina, how are you?
I'm great, Devin. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. Always love doing the show. And before we jump in to you, your background, and what you're currently working on right now, same question goes for you. What are you currently binge watching, if anything at all?
Well, I just finished Bridgerton, which was kind of the follow-up to Emily in Paris for me. So it's a good escapism show.
Awesome. I will have to check that one out. I saw a couple people drop that one in the chat as well. So after the episode, I'm logging off for the day and I'm going to watch Bridgerton. But as we jump in to the topic at hand around DE&I, kind of as a tradition on the show, we always love to do a deep dive on people's LinkedIn page, see where they've come from and how they've gotten to where they are today. And I've seen that you worked in banking. You're an author, currently working on a book, still work out of college. Can you walk us through your journey and how you became a DE&I expert, and also what you do at HRComputes?
Absolutely. Well, I'm the managing principal at HRComputes, and our firm specializes in helping organizations with their people strategy in terms of how can they take the path that they want to go on in terms of culture, direction, people engagement, and how can technology support that path. And, you know, as you mentioned, I have a lot of things in my background. I spent many years in banking. I am an author. I'm currently an MBA professor with the Bard MBA and Sustainability program. And I think the background to all of this is really rooted in social responsibility and environmental justice. And many, many times I've talked to organizations and they really don't understand the connectivity between decisions made around environmental justice in terms of pollution, in terms of plant location, and how that impacts society. So that's really the foundation of where I jump off on the DEI conversation. There are lots of tools to use, but I really think it's a deep dive into the culture and values of your organization and the strategic direction.
Culture and values, I think, is something that has been highlighted a tremendous amount over what feels like 100 years, but it's only been around a year now. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, Mark Cuban had that famous quote, maybe infamous quote about what organizations are doing now not only affects them today and tomorrow, but it could affect if they even have an organization in the future. But we've spoken prior to the show, and I've read some articles that you've written on the subject. You mentioned that DE&I is a continuum and that each organization has its own journey. Can you go into more detail on that for the audience?
Absolutely. Let me share my screen. Hopefully it's going to come up in a second.
No worries.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So this is my diversity, equity, and inclusion maturity continuum. And what it is meant to depict is that organizations are on their own journey on this, very important issue. And it starts on the left with compliance. And most organizations are trying to comply with the law. And that's kind of the baby step. If you're not there, you have some serious risk issues going on, but that's a starting point. And then moving to the right is really when you become aware of the business benefit of a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, when you become aware of your stakeholder requirements, and you really start to think about and ideate about what should your DEI strategy look like. And then the steps to the right of that are really more integration into your operation. So, how are you integrating it into your talent pipeline, both from a candidate perspective and from an employee development and opportunity and leadership development perspective? And then how are you really integrating it into your full operations? How is it being reflected in your team structures, your team meetings, your goals, your supply chain, your leadership strategy? And then moving beyond that to the ecosystem integration is really holistically looking at what are your peer institutions doing? What kind of public-private partnerships exist? What kind of partnerships with NGOs exist to really drive change and to really change both internal and external systems that can act as barriers or conduits, depending upon the side and the approach that you're taking.
No, that makes complete sense, and it reminds me of some things that we've done here at Phenom in the past around accessibility, right? You mentioned the compliance aspect and how you can get in some legal trouble, but also the effect that has on people throughout the organization who may not suffer from disability, who may not fall into particularly DE&I a category, if you will. It's better for everyone. You mentioned the culture, you mentioned internal employees as well as external candidates, and I think all of that plays a huge role in this challenge that organizations are faced. It's not just helping one specific group of individuals, it can really help your entire organization. But what are key areas organizations should focus on when it comes to this, and who are the key players involved?
So I took a deeper dive into the talent portion of it with this slide to try to answer that question in more detail. The short answer is who is involved really depends upon where you are in your cycle. In order to be most effective, this needs to be a board initiative. It needs to be a C-suite initiative. It can certainly be quarterbacked by HR and the CHRO, but it really needs to involve everyone because, as you said, Devin, it's not just about one group of people. This is about creating a culture of belonging. This is about making things as wonderful for every employee that you can, so that they feel comfortable in coming to work, that they can bring their true selves to work, and they can contribute fully to your organization. So, if we take a little bit of a deeper dive into the talent side of it, this is where you're really focusing on embedding DEI into your talent strategy and into your pipeline. And this focuses on your brand, your recruitment message, your talent pool that you're approaching, your sources of talent, but it also looks internally at how are you developing people, how are you making opportunities available to them, what's involved in your leadership training, who gets to be, who's considered eligible for leadership training, how is all this information communicated and disseminated. It also relates to your promotion and performance ratings and how all of those processes work in the organization. So at this level, you really do need senior leadership involvement. It might be very much an HR driven program, but you definitely need senior leadership buy-in so that it cascades across the organization. And you can see some of the actions here, in terms of integrating, DEI into your recruitment, development, and advancement protocols, building relationships with more diverse institutions and groups. Many of you may have heard of the historically Black colleges and universities as a talent pool for Black Americans, but also community colleges can serve as a great resource for that, or public universities. And then the outcomes are on the right side in terms of things that you can expect from doing these types of actions and driving these types of programs and initiatives across the organization and making them important to the culture of your organization.
I completely agree. And one thing that I love that you mentioned there was historically Black colleges and universities. We've had some individuals on the show previously talking about university recruiting and how that's changed because of the pandemic. And one thing that I challenged a lot of individuals to was, since you no longer have to travel, you no longer have to pay for airfare or rent a car in order to get to some of these university career events, is to open up your talent pool, right? Expand from those typical universities that you have. And that can be just one step in the process. I saw a couple comments come through, one from Tom Tate. which is I've seen so much one-size-fits-all thoughts and recommendations on DE&I. Definitely appreciate seeing this as a continuum and a more realistic journey. And then Jen Thomas chimes in with agree. It's not something you can just check off the box. It is ongoing. And I think that is, 100% accurate as we look at this now. We live in a let's fix it right now sort of situation, right? Like what can I do to upgrade my Zoom? What can I do to get more sales deals, whatever it may be? When I think you have to look at this as a larger picture, right? Almost as a fixer-upper home, if you will, right? There's no just flick of the switch that is going to fix your roof or do anything like that for you. It is a process that you have to continue to work at, and as times change, you're going to have to change your ways as well. Now, driving organizational systemic change related to DE&I takes time and resources. What are some specific actions HR leaders can do to get the ball rolling?
That's a great question. I think HR leaders act very well as coaches and supporters. And I think, if you're trying to get the ball rolling, if you're in the C-suite, you're in a position to perhaps engage with another C-suite leader to act as an ally. Maybe that's the CEO, maybe it's the CFO, maybe it's the COO, but to act as an ally and a co-supporter in raising these issues to the broader group. If you're not in that capacity, my advice would be to find someone on the C-suite who will act as your supporter and advocate, and perhaps serve to be a pilot to initiate some of these programs to demonstrate to the rest of the organization the effectiveness and the path forward for them.
So you mentioned a number of C-suite individuals there. As these processes are going forward, how can those leaders support for educational needs as well as really just training for employees and managers who may not be at that upper echelon level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we need the leadership to act as role models. So they need to demonstrate these actions in their daily activities. So when they are looking to recruit someone for a senior level position, they need to take a very broad approach and expand perhaps their resources of where they're looking for talent. They also need to make goals and objectives part of their team's performance appraisal. So it's about what are you asking people to do? What are you compensating them to do? And then what kind of tools are you giving them? What kind of technology will support this initiative? What kind of training will support this initiative? Are we talking about this at all of our staff meetings? Are we talking about this on our C-suite agendas, on our board agendas? So it's about role models. It's about providing tools, resources, and training. It's about holding everyone accountable.
And Morris chimes in with a question, which was, he stole my thunder. It was the next question that I have, which is, how do you measure the impact of these training or recruitment changes? And I think that's because we live in a data-driven world, whether we like it or not. I can't even turn on a sports game now without them diving into these really granular metrics. What are some metrics that we can look at for initiatives like this, and how can we consider them or even find them out?
So, I am a big fan of metrics. Obviously, we use a lot of metrics in our work. We believe that by measuring things and sharing the data regularly, you help change the decision process. And that's really what I mean by data-driven decisions. What does the data tell you? Move from intuition to data wherever possible. So what I have up on the screen now are some metrics that can be used to help identify, hotspots or areas that you want to have improvement on or to measure improvement. The one caution that I make with metrics is that you have to understand what your goal is and then select the metric that best measures progress towards that goal. Don't just pick a metric because a competitor uses that metric, or you went to an event and they talked about that metric. Make sure that the metric that you're using actually measures what you're trying to achieve. And so there, the IG on this slide means identity group. So if you're trying to drill down into certain categories for diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's what the IG means for. But it's all about understanding what is being reflected in your organization. So that's the assessment, retention, recruitment. These are kind of hot button issues, and some suggestions on metrics to measure those.
I love the idea of diving into the metrics and the data around this, because over the summer and even as of late, there's been so much talk around woke washing and the kind of just doing something to make your organization feel or look good. How can strategic alignment avoid creating these sort of issues and really barriers for organizations?
Well, I think understanding where you are, and if we go back to the continuum, understanding where you are in your journey relative to that, and then making sure your external messaging and your internal reality are more in alignment than perhaps we've seen. As you kicked off the show, you talked about the Black Lives Matter movement. We've talked about political unrest, social unrest. We've seen a lot of organizations, post things in support of these movements. But when you look internally, or, you look on Glassdoor, or, today in the world that we live in, information is readily available. Everything is transparency. So, 20, 30 years ago, an organization could lock down its secrets that they didn't really want to get out. But today, that's very transparent, and it's reported all over the place. And as soon as something happens, it's being tweeted. So it's, you really have to be conscious of what you're saying to your customers, to your other stakeholders, and making sure it is consistent and in alignment with what you're doing internally. And some of these measures can help you gauge where you are. And if you are representing to a candidate community, that they'll be very welcome in your organization, and the turnover for that particular candidate community's identity group is astronomical, you have a disconnect there that you really need to address, and you need to be authentic in how you're going to address that.
And this is another question that I have around that, is you mentioned earlier the importance of figuring out what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve for those metrics to really be valuable. Would you recommend sharing your goals externally, or is that something that should just only be kept internally in your organization?
Well, I think on a high level, you can certainly share your goals, because those really are your value statements. I mean, your goal, the goal in this is to create a culture of belonging where everyone can bring their true selves to work every day and fully contribute, and have the resources, have the empowerment, have the respect to contribute in a meaningful way. So that's a very high level goal. When you get into your metrics and details, there are a lot of public companies that share certain amounts of this information. I think that is a decision that you need to make depending upon what is happening in your peer group, what is happening with investor demand, what is happening with shareholder demand. So some of that will answer the question. If you're a privately held company that doesn't share data on this level, I think you might want to consider how much you want to share, and to what extent it helps or hurts your ultimate goal.
That makes sense. Earlier, you also mentioned a tremendous amount around transparency and the role that technology plays in transparency. How can technology not only provide transparency, but how can it also help support DE&I efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many, many ways. The one cautionary statement that I will make is that technology is not a silver bullet. It is a tool to be used in conjunction with your strategy, with your roadmap, with your other resources to achieve your goals. So we use technology from an assessment point of view. There's some tremendous tools out there to allow you to do pulse surveys, to allow natural language reading, to help inform opinions from employees and from other stakeholders. So that is one area. I think a platform like Phenom has a lot of advantage for building diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the fact that you can broaden your candidate pool through the platform, that you can share stories from a diverse group of employees that work in your organization, that you can share their experiences authentically with candidates so that candidates can truly see themselves within your organization and understand what others' experiences have been, and people that perhaps they identify with in your organization, and they feel much more comfortable in applying and engaging with that organization. Because there is a disconnect between people saying, oh, I want to have a goal of 20% representation of an identity group in my organization and getting there. Because if you don't have a culture that those people feel they will be allowed to do well, perform well, thrive, have opportunity, you're not going to achieve your goal. It's not like working your current sales structure. You have to really rethink, your entire processes. I also think something like internal mobility through a product like Phenom is a great asset, because so many people are given stretch opportunities, but most people don't know about those stretch opportunities or gig opportunities, internally, where it's a small project that you get exposed to different people, or a project that you get exposed to the next level of management. And that's the way that people move up in organizations. And if those are controlled privately and without transparency, it's very hard for broad-based employees to move up to get additional opportunities within an organization.
That makes total sense. And we did have another comment from Morris, and this ties into I think what you'd said earlier around a silver bullet. So does technology reduce or increase unconscious bias? A bit of a loaded question, if I do say so myself, because I know there's a lot of opinions on this. But what would you say?
There's been a lot of research on artificial intelligence, and I think it really comes down to how are you building your tool, and understanding that if you go back to the beginning, you need diverse voices in building that tool. You need diverse representation in building that tool. The tool can't be built on one single identity group. Amazon has their famous case of trying to build an AI tool for predicting who will be a good employee. Unfortunately, all of their data was white males. And so the AI taught itself that white males are the most successful employees, which historically they had been, because that's all they had, to the point where the AI was striking candidates that went to women's colleges. It learned its lesson very well. So, unconscious bias can unfortunately be brought into tools if they are not developed properly, if they are not developed with diverse voices, and with diverse sets of data, candidates that representing very diverse data. So it's you have to be careful with tool development, and that's not my area of expertise. I'm sure there are people at Phenom that think about that issue all the time, and even things like, how can people with sight impairment view technology? How are things accessible to them, or other impairments? Everything needs to be thought of in a much broader way in terms of how will that AI function and what do we need to be conscious of and cautious about. And just remember that it needs to be checked and there needs to be transparency of process, and that it just doesn't run on itself without any kind of intervention and verification.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the saying of kind of garbage in, garbage out, right? You have to make sure that your original data set is diverse enough initially, and is really not, doesn't have any bias to begin with, because the AI is just going to crank that out even faster, which is not something that organizations are looking for when they purchase or roll out that sort of technology. Obviously, there are numerous outcomes that individual organizations are looking for. And it looks like we have another comment here. Having humans in the feedback loop to prevent bias from entering data is critical, and I couldn't agree more. But when it comes to the outcomes of having an effective DE&I strategy, what do those look like?
Well, there are all kinds of outcomes. I think often what catches the attention of senior leadership is that there's been a lot of research to show companies that are more diverse have much higher financial outcomes. They outperform their peers, that there's much higher levels of innovation at diverse firms. They have the opportunity to access marketplaces that perhaps a less diverse firm does not. So there are certainly a wide variety of business enhancement opportunities in terms of outcome. I also think that outcome in terms of diversity, from my perspective, allows an organization to be more agile and ultimately more resilient. Because you have different people approaching problems from different perspectives. You have people that have different needs and requirements approaching customer service and solution derivation. So you have, less of a linear path, and that builds agility and resiliency in organizations. And I think most people want an organization where they feel they can fully contribute. And empowering people to do that really builds tremendous, employee dedication. It also builds customer dedication. I don't know how many of you have seen the articles recently, but law firms are now being asked, who is working on my account and what is the diversity representation in terms of the lawyers working on my account? And if you are not meeting those, many large companies like Amazon and Intel are saying, we're going to reduce your bill rate. So, there are many, many outcomes, both customer driven, supply chain driven, and, overall business success driven.
Yeah, that idea of law firms, kind of being targeted on their diversity, talks directly, I think, to Morris's point here. It's diversity of thought. It's the idea of people from different backgrounds having different opinions and even different ideas that is so important and really, I think, makes organizations stronger and better for the long haul. Obviously, we couldn't dive into everything today, and there is a ton around DE&I initiatives, but what are a few resources that people should look into during their projects that they're ongoing?
I have a list here of, kind of some foundational tools that I think can help you get going on your initiatives. There are many, many tools out there and many great articles, but the diversity wheel really speaks to what you were just saying, Devin, and that is that there's identity diversity, but there's also experience diversity and cognitive diversity. So it's very complex in terms of levels of diversity. And I think the wheel helps explain that in a visual way. If you've not heard of unconscious bias or implicit bias, there's a free tool. It's on the Harvard website, and it's an implicit bias test. There's several of them that you can take to start to understand how this works. It's unconscious, and it's basically part of our, fight or flight ethos as human beings. We make decisions very quickly, and they reflect our bias. And so that helps you understand that perspective a little bit more. Race has been a big issue, and I think this is a good little toolkit talking about race. SHRM is a good resource for all things DEI. They have kind of a standard toolkit for getting started. They also have a newer article about, a checklist. I'm not a big believer in checklists, but I think that at least having some kind of framework to begin putting your mind around all the different components is helpful. And then, the why diversity matters really speaks to the business reasons for diversity and for adding value to your organizations.
These are all great. And one thing that I thought you were going to say, but you didn't, was if you haven't heard of implicit bias or unconscious bias, you probably have a little bit of bias in you, right? Because we all have that. So thank you for sharing these. I certainly need to check some of these out and take a look at them. We will include them in the blog recap that we send out following this episode, and we'll also put it in the show notes on YouTube. Kristina, before I let you go, I wanted to give you the floor. Any parting shots, any words of wisdom, one tidbit that you'd like people to hang on to from this episode?
I think it's really important that we all take the time to listen to one another and understand each other's perspectives and understand each other's stories and journeys. We'll learn a lot just by taking that step.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we can get you on in the future. Once we have this pandemic kind of settled down, we can get you in our studio, in the office, and everything like that. But I really appreciate it, and I wish you nothing but the best, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Devin. Really appreciate you having me.
Awesome.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye. Oh, well, there you have it. That was Walking the Walk with Kristina Kohl. I wanted to thank everyone for participating today. Thank you, Morris. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Ankit. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Jonathan. It was awesome. Lenroy, this has been spectacular. But before we go, I did want to share one clip from last week's episode. We had our guest, Mary Miller, CEO of Jancoa and strategic coach for entrepreneurs, as well as a self-proclaimed dream manager. I'm still working on getting that title myself, but she had a ton of great insight last week around a transformational 2020 and empowering talent to realize their potential. So I could talk about it more, but instead, let's just air the clip.
Goals are tactical. Those are tasks that you have, and that always feels good to build your energy when you can do the check mark in the box that you've accomplished something. But when you think about it, when you talk about dreams of building your career, of home ownership, expanding a family, there's always a high level of emotion connected with a dream. And to achieve the dream, the ideal of a great quality of life, there's goals on the way to do that. So the dream is the big ideal of the quality of life and what you want to have in your life. And the goals are the tactical components you do to move toward achieving those dreams. So it's emotion, task, and that kind of divides the two.
Last week with Mary was one of my favorite episodes, so definitely check that out. Before I let you go, as always, we will be live here next Thursday at noon. So tune in, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, whatever you have to do to be reminded. But we will be here, or you can always catch the replay on the Phenom blog. But I hope everyone is safe, everyone is healthy, and we'll see you next week.